welcome everybody. This is another episode of the Next Gen webinar series, and we're excited today to have Kris Lott, who is the Director of Youth Ministry at Calvary United Methodist Church, and he's going to be talking about suicide prevention, breaking the silence, equipping youth workers to help prevent suicide. We have some folks that are also on the video recording with us, and at the end, they'll have the opportunity to ask questions. And then if you are watching this and would like to ask questions of Kris or of us at Next Gen Ministries, you'll see a website and an email address that will pop up at the end of the recording. And so, Kris, I just want to welcome you in and thank you for joining us. And we're looking forward to learning from you about this topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Brad. A little bit about me, like you already said, was I'm a youth minister at Calvary United Methodist Church in Nashville, Tennessee. I've been on staff, or the youth minister, since 2004. And a little bit about my story is I was looking into ordination, where I felt called, and I was kind of steered away from ordination and moved toward counseling. So in 2016, I graduated from Trevecca with a master's in marriage and family therapy. And it's been neat to see how the counseling and the youth ministry can overlap and how often they do. And over the last 2 years, suicide prevention has become something that's very important to me and something I'm passionate about and happy to share about with you guys today.
My experience with suicide started in my early years as a youth minister, and what to do started back when I didn't know what to do. And one day, one of my youth over the summer called me. She wasn't even a very active youth, but she called me and said, "Hey, Kris, one of my friends just told me he was going to kill himself. What do I do?" And I had no idea. I didn't know this kid. I hardly knew this youth. But within the next 2 hours, long story short, I ended up at this kid's house inside talking to him, saying, you can talk to this crisis line number that I randomly had Googled, or I can call the police. And I left that day being frustrated. I think I ended up doing the right thing that day, but I left it saying, gosh, I really have no idea what I should have done there. And looking back, I was present, and I did the important thing, which was get him help. But that started a long time ago, me trying to better understand what's going on. Fast forward to today, where in our group, we do annual suicide prevention programming with our youth and our families. I've had conversations with Brad on trying to create some kind of suicide prevention or requirement in safe sanctuaries. But even with all this work that we've done and all the knowledge I've given the youth and our families, this last semester, we still had 2 youth in our group that had attempts. So even with all the work, it's still out there. And our youth are facing higher levels of anxiety and stress than ever before. And we as youth ministers, as volunteers, as youth workers, are often on the front lines with our relationship with our youth. And this is why we need to be willing to break the silence and ask the hard questions around suicide. So I start today with the Golden Gate Bridge. Kevin Hines, in September of 2000, Kevin Hines leapt off the Golden Gate Bridge, which is a method of suicide attempts that has resulted in the death of most of the 2,000 people who made the jump since the bridge was erected in 1937. Kevin is one of 36, less than 1%, to have survived the fall. And they do now have nets up on the bridge to kind of prevent jumps. But listen to his words. He's one of the biggest advocates now in suicide prevention. And this is from one of his books. And I want you to hear what he said was going through his mind leading up to him jumping. So here are these words. These are Kevin's. "I went out on the Golden Gate Bridge. On the bus, I began to cry softly in the back. On the bus, I began thinking, if one person comes up to me and says, 'Are you okay?' I'll turn around. If one person comes up to me and asks if anything's wrong, I'll tell them everything. I go out at the parking lot and I thought to myself, Kevin, turn around, get back on the bus, go back. Then I heard voices, you must die, you must die. So I walked onto the span. I must have been there for 40 minutes. And once again, I thought, one person has to come up to me and say, "Are you okay?" One person, anybody. A woman was approaching me, and I thought, "Oh, thank God. Thank you, God." She had on sunglasses and an accent. She came up to me and said, "Will you take my picture?" I took her picture 5 times. As she left, I said nobody cared. I turned around, backed up to the railing next to the roadway, ran and catapulted myself over with my arms. The split second I hit free fall, I thought, "Oh my God, I don't want to die. What did I just do?" I was wide awake, the voices were gone, and I was right there facing ultimate death. So listening to that story, as youth ministers and youth workers, what do you hear? You hear that he was feeling alone and he was feeling abandoned. And what did he need? He didn't need someone to fix all his problems. He just needed someone to see him and to see that he was there. He needed a relationship, someone that saw he was in pain. He wasn't looking again for anyone to fix his problems. He just wanted someone to ask, "Are you okay?" So that leads to this quote that Kevin has. He says, "Most people considering suicide want someone to save them. We need a culture in which no one is afraid to ask." So again, the second he let go of the bridge, he regretted his decision. And it is our job, is we have to create an environment in our ministries that allow for those moments for us to ask the hard questions. And we have to not be afraid of asking, and we need to be willing to listen, and we need to be willing to act. So that's kind of our starting point on what our goals are and how I break the silence. So a little bit of background today as we go through how I'm going to help all of us better understand suicide is we're going to look at 4 factors. We're going to look at or 4 pieces kind of. We're going to look at phenomenology, which is a study of language and how we hear language. And then we're going to look at specific terminology. We're going to look at statistics. We're going to talk about risk factors. But the main thing that I want you to help understand is what to do. And I want you to see warning signs, to understand, suicide on a whole, and then know what to do. So we start with this common phrase that you'll hear in a lot of suicide prevention presentations is suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And again, it's in those temporary moments where people make harsh decisions, and that's where we can be on the front lines to help intervene. Considering that most students who are suicidal contemplate suicide for 1 day or less. And again, kind of doing a follow-up on the study, most of the 515 individuals who were restrained from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, in a 27-year follow-up, only 5% had completed suicide. So really, the numbers do show that it's in those temporary problem or 1 day or less. It's not something that's necessarily ongoing, but it's in that moment when the pain is real and the voices are real. They lose. Often people cannot make the decision of suicide. So to better understand, we're going to jump into those 4 pieces that I described earlier. And we're going to start with some statistics. And we could spend all day. We could spend the whole hour looking at statistics. But some of these just to give you some of the national numbers. But basically, 1 out of 6 students nationwide, high school students, seriously considered suicide in the past year. 100 young people die by suicide every week. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people ages 10 to 24. And we lose more teens and young adults to suicide than die from cancer, heart disease, AIDS, birth defects, lung diseases, strokes, and chronic lung diseases combined. So those, to me, again, those numbers are staggering. A couple more are each day in our nation, there's an average of over 5,000 attempts by young people ages 7 to 12th grade. Youth suicides have tripled since the late 1960s, and over 100% increase in suicides for ages 10 to 14 since 1980. So it is not just high school students. It is middle school students. I know locally there was a 6th grader who completed suicide last year. So this is a conversation that we need to be having at an early age.
So to put it another way, in a youth group of 100 students, according to the national statistics, 18 of those students out of the 100 would have considered attempting suicide during the last 12 months. And 14 of those students would have made a plan about how they would attempt suicide during the last 12 months. And of the 100, 8 students would have attempted suicide one or more times during the last 12 months. Now, these statistics really show the magnitude of the problem and further emphasize why we need to dig deeper to better understand the problem and why we need to equip youth workers, volunteers, and churches to be aware of the statistics and what to do. So that's what we're going to look at now.
Any questions?
So at the end of each section, I'll kind of ask if there is any questions. But moving on, so one of the pieces besides statistics we're going to talk about is phenomenology. And I kind of got lost on the internet trying to better understand how to explain this. And here's how I'm going to do it. So we move from looking at the numbers to the words we use in our lives. Phenomenology is the study of intention from a first-person perspective. Basically, another way of saying that is the study of experience and how we experience. I can hear and understand the same words that Brad hears, and he might understand them differently. So the same thing goes with when we start talking about the verbiage around suicide. If one of your youth says at youth group or something, if I fail this test, I'm going to kill myself. One of the, is that person serious? Or are they just being sarcastic, or are they just being, trying to be funny? So that's where you begin to the need to understand, this is a time to start digging in further when you start hearing suicide language and understanding how one person can say it and mean it, and while one person can say it and not mean it. This relationship is going to kill me. Again, the same words can have different meanings for different people. So I just want you to get to begin to understand. That's kind of your first warning sign in general. If you hear people using suicide or talking about injury, or killing themselves, or even hurting themselves in conversation, it's kind of you'll hear me say a lot today that you should trust your gut and look for warning signs. And this may be, if you hear language, it's your first time to kind of turn on your alarm system and say, okay, it's time to dig it a little deeper. Is this person really struggling with something? Or do we need to talk about what kind of language you should use or not be using? That's the idea around how, again, phenomenology is how I can hear something, I can say something and mean it, and you could hear it the same words and not mean it. So it's just to get us thinking. So, but basically, because of that, the medical community and the mental health community wanted to move to a more precise terminology, because there were so many, because words do have different meanings. So again, there has been this move to specific languages on what to use. And I'm going to kind of walk us through this on this slide. And as we say, I'm going to try to turn my pointer on here, Brad. So, for a while, everyone, the most common phrase we'll hear is committed suicide. And, there's an issue around that this is a phrase that's associated with committed to something that a criminal does, or it's a sin. Again, the preferred language we normally want to hear in the mental health world is, they died by suicide or they took their own life. Well, a few years ago, they moved to the idea of completed suicide was what we should say, or successful suicide. And this, again, was problematic because it indicates that it was the desired outcome. Like you were checking off your checklist, like, hey, good job, I completed something. And again, you'll hear took their own life, ended their own life by suicide, or the terminology that we're going to want to use when we're talking about it. We also want to avoid using language that glamorizes a suicide attempt. We don't want to say it was a failed suicide or a suicide bid. And the language here we'd want would be they made an attempt on their life, or it was a suicide attempt, or even the more clinical non-fatal attempt. You'll also see and hear a lot these days is phrases that sensationalize suicide. So suicide epidemic. And we just don't want to sensationalize. We just want to, use that clinical higher rates, increasing rates, concerning rates. And then this is something you'll see even more and more is using the word suicide out of context. It's a suicide mission, or that's political suicide. In basketball for practice, the kids run suicides, which is where you sprint back and forth. When you start looking for this, you see a lot of uses of this out of context terms. This is again where we want to start educating everyone, ourselves and our youth, just refraining from using this word out of context. This is not, and it is hard once you start noticing how often it is used. And then specifically for, again, some knowledge on what is a suicide attempt. The clinical definition is it's a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of the behavior. So now, in common language, a suicide attempt may or may not result in injury. There does not have to be harm, and people often have mixed emotions. So that does mean, if as far as mixed emotions, if 2% of me want to die and the other 98 just want to make mom mad, we still consider that a suicide attempt. If any percent of them wanted to die when they did it, there does not have to be harm. Up here, if someone puts a gun in their mouth and pulls the trigger, but the gun fails to go off, even though he was not hurt, once they pull the trigger, it's considered a suicide attempt. So it's just technical terms to kind of increase your knowledge. You can have an interrupted attempt, which was an attempt stopped by others, or you can have an aborted attempt, which is where the person themselves stopped at any part of the act. So it can be prior or during the act where they actually stopped themselves.
So sometimes I hear, and I think we said it earlier, maybe completed suicide. Is that like when we talk about attempted and then completed? And I know that I've heard the term successful. It's like, it's not successful to me when somebody has completed suicide, So completed suicide is problematic.
Yes, because you complete your checklist like that. Okay. I have a task list, and it makes it sound like, hey, they accomplished what they are after. We don't want to get a desirable outcome. Okay. Is the terminology. Okay. So as we go through, now that we've talked about the precise language and we've talked about, the statistics, now we're going to get into the kind of the meat of the program, which is the risk factors in deciding when to intervene. And what does that look like for a youth worker, a non-professional, someone who is at the local church level? What does it mean to intervene anyway? So we're going to talk about, just suicide risk as a spectrum from low to high. And then we're going to talk about warning signs, and we're going to talk about what to do and when to do it. And as we go through, if we were sitting in the same room, I always ask people to start thinking of how you would talk to a youth or a young person, or really how you would talk to anyone about suicide. If they came up to you, or if one of their friends came up and said, hey, so-and-so has told me he wants to kill himself. I want to help you guys start thinking of questions that you could ask, how you would ask, what questions would ask, and when you need to ask the questions. So I'll kind of give you some sample questions at each stage of on all the kind of slides going forward on when and what you should ask at this point. So thinking of it as far as suicide risk as a spectrum, we're going to start, kind of on one side, which is the very low, on the far left, I guess, the no suicide ideation. So no thoughts of suicide. And this is, of course, a very low risk at this point. This is where someone might have a normal, this could be for any age. So if there was a, normal focus on end of life issues.
If someone was sick or old, it's natural to have some thoughts about death.
And here, just it's very low, but you may occasionally have thoughts of, what would it be like if I wasn't here? But they're not preoccupied with death. They do not feel that they would be better off dead. So again, this is the very kind of the lowest end of suicide ideation. There is no suicide ideation at this point. And here, now we start moving into the spectrum that we're going to go to passive suicide ideation. And this is where I just want to highlight, importantly, this is a mild risk, but you notice at this stage, the non-professional, someone on the church level, this is where you need to find help. So even at this stage, it's now time to go find a professional, talk to mom and dad, bring someone else into the conversation to get this person help. But at the passive suicide ideation stage, this person has not considered, a method of self-harm. They don't know. They've thought about it, but they don't have a method. They are maybe more preoccupied with death at this point. They might have thoughts that life is not worth living or that they would be better off dead. And again, at this point, it's time to get help. It's time to bring in the parents. And what this might look like with the preoccupation with death is, maybe in their prayer that there would be something, or you might hear them say, I wish God would take me soon. Again, it's not specific. There's no plan. Some questions that a person at this stage could ask someone in the passive suicide ideation stage could be, do you have thoughts of wanting to die? Or do you wish you didn't have to go on living? Just kind of asking, like, kind of focusing on these, are you preoccupied with death, or, is life worth living? So that's passive. But again, I want to reiterate, for all these from here on out are referrals. So we go from passive, we can move to active suicide ideation thoughts. And again, this is while we say moderate risk, this is an immediate referral. This is where they have considered a method of self-harm to harm self. And maybe here now the youth does not report a specific detailed plan again. But they might still be able to demonstrate reasons for living and good impulse control, but they have a plan. So this is where we need to, an example of this is the youth saying, I thought about taking all my pills, but I would never do it. So they know how they would do it, but they're still showing good impulse control and no intention in doing it. But this again would be where you would want to get mom and dad, someone else, get clinical help here. Questions or sample questions you might want to ask at this stage of active suicide ideation is, again, asking, do you have suicidal thoughts? Asking them about their plan. Have you made a plan? Do you know what you would do? These are all ways where you could, are signs that, hey, they're actually thinking about it. We need to get immediate help at this point. And the last one before we'll take questions up to the next slide, but then that last one is the highest specific suicide plan or intent. This is the highest risk. We're not leaving them alone. We're escorting them to the hospital. We're calling crisis, or waiting until they get their until their parents arrive. At this stage, the student would report a specific detailed plan and current intention to harm self. And they're not showing good impulse control at this point. An example of what they might say is, I'm planning to take my pills tomorrow morning before my parents wake up. Like, they have a specific plan. They know they know when they're going to do it.
I'm worried that I might not be able to stop myself from taking my pills tomorrow morning. Again, they're showing no impulse control and worried about their actions.
Earlier in the year, as I described in the beginning of the presentation, I was sitting in my office with a youth in December, and she had disclosed that, after talking with her, she was very much in this stage. In the middle of the conversation, I reached across the table and grabbed her car keys and said, "You're not leaving. We're going together, or we're leaving together, or we're leaving with your parents." So at this stage, I literally took her car keys from her, and was like, we're going to travel together at this point.
She had hit all the marks, and I clearly recognized that she had a specific plan and was no impulse control, and I wasn't going to leave my side.
Questions you could ask someone at this stage was, have you decided on a method? This is, again, just checking to see, if they have a plan, we're not leaving them. If they're showing bad impulse control, we're not leaving them. What has stopped you from putting your plan into action could be a question. Have you started preparations for suicide? How long have you had the plan? Have you set a date? Have you written a note? my youth was checking all the boxes at this point. She had written a note. She had a plan. And she told me she was worried that she wouldn't be able to she was worried that she was going to enact the plan. And so that was the point where I was like, okay, we're going to the hospital.
At what point do you, like with this girl, she had obviously must have driven herself there, and so you're calling her parent at that point, or you're calling her parent while you're on the way to the hospital, or you're calling her parent and say, hey, what do you want to do? We're going to go. So what do you do there?
So this was a unique case. Part of her deal was her parents. She didn't want her parents involved, which her parents showed up once we eventually called, and of course they were concerned. But in her mind, her parents were not willing to help her and understood. In her mind, her parents would just blame her and say, no, it's not. She's not going to do anything. It's fine. Send her home. So I was like, okay, instead of dealing with mom and dad at this point, she needed immediate help. We just went to the ER, and it took 3 or 4 hours to get her to the point of being admitted into the mental hospital. But at that point, parents had to be called. And of course, as soon as we called them, they rushed to the hospital and stepped up. And I do think she was right. They maybe were minimizing how seriously they thought it was. But then it was an awakening. But they showed up at that point and engaged, which was a good thing. But my point was, at that stage, if parents weren't going to come, I was like, all right, I'm just going to take you, or we can call the crisis line and see if they'll come out and pick up the youth. All right. So moving on. So that's kind of the spectrum. That's kind of just, again, for your knowledge and kind of better seeing how someone is thinking. But now we're going to look for specific warning signs. And these are the warning signs that, like, this is part of the presentation that we give to our youth and to our parents. These are some of those, if you've ever been to any kind of suicide presentation. As we go through warning signs, I just, again, remind you that as youth workers, we're on the front lines with our youth. I have a story of, occasionally we do prayer concerns in a different way. Every week we do kind of prayer concerns in a different way. And one night, a couple years ago, we had them write down on note cards and put them in the offering basket. But on this day, we did the prayer concerns, and I rolled in the office Monday afternoon after staff meeting and started reading them. And there was one that I was concerned enough about, a suicide threat, that I hadn't read. And I immediately called the parents, and they were aware of it. So I kind of had a big sigh of relief. And that's affected a policy change with myself and our volunteers as we go through every prayer concern. If we write something down, we're reading it on Sunday night.
Because we don't want to miss one. If someone reaches out, I want to make sure that we get the message right away. The statistics show that 4 out of 5 people reach out before then an attempt. And if this is their way of reaching out, we want to make sure we read it that day.
So as we go through these, again, these are the warning signs, or big warning signs for you to notice. First off, if they're making suicidal threats, now again, these are not always verbal. These are text messages. These are social media. But if you hear them saying something, I'd be better off dead. You won't have me around here much longer to bother you. I wish I was dead. I wish I could go to sleep and never wake up. Or literally the words I'm for myself. These are all major warning signs that that we need to intervene if you hear these questions here. You could ask someone, and this is where you might have another youth come up to you and say, I heard Johnny's talking about suicide or hurting himself. So this is going to be often where you're going to have to call the youth over and check in. So some questions here to start was, did you talk to others about killing yourself? Have you told anyone that you're going to kill yourself? So if you're getting yeses to those questions, we're going for an immediate referral. So again, and also this is something where social media has another whole. Some people post things as a joke. Some people are serious. Some people don't think you're reading them. So it's kind of like, if you see it, you kind of need to start checking in with this youth or with this family. It is a major warning sign. Next is if they've had a previous attempt. 1 out of 3 suicide deaths is not the individual's first attempt. And the risk for completing suicide is more than 100 times greater during the first year after an attempt. Even if the youth attempt is only for attention, we take it seriously. So yeah, we take them all. Anything, even self-harm, we take seriously. If a youth thinks that taking 8 Advil is going to kill themselves, we still keep that. We still take that in attention. We take that as a big warning sign, even if it wasn't going to harm them. And like I said earlier, if 2% wants to die and 98% wants to piss off their boyfriend or girlfriend, we still take that 2% as a suicide attempt. And the question here you could ask, I guess, if someone came up to you and you wanted to ask them a question on suicide previous attempts, you could just say, have you ever tried to take your life before? So again, don't overthink these questions. It's just be direct and don't be afraid to ask about suicide. So we'll kind of get into how we ask in a second. The next warning sign is, and this is kind of a big one to look, and this is where, again, you're on the front line and you see a sudden change in behavior. It's time for you to kind of engage and say, okay, what's going on with this youth? Is it something, or is it suicide? Just because this is where you're on the front lines. You need to really check in with the kid. But this is sudden changes are where the quiet kid becomes loud and obnoxious. The loud person doesn't talk anymore. The football star quits the team, or they quit coming to youth in general. The gentle person is now aggressive and angry a lot. The outgoing person is withdrawn. The perfect valedictorian is now failing their classes. And the month leading up to the youth I was describing in December, one of her big things was track. And she was a track stud. Like, she was awesome, and she's not an upperclassman yet, but she was a dominant track person. And she told me in the beginning of the semester, I asked her about track. She goes, "Oh, I just quit that." So that was already a big warning sign for me. And she was already on my radar when I heard that. And she had quit a couple other things that she was really that was really important to her. So that was already big red flag. So I
Already had her on my radar, and I was checking in throughout the semester. And even though I was getting nothing is wrong as an answer, those check-ins paid off because she felt comfortable enough coming to me later.
questions around these.
Yeah, Kris, you talked about the training. Like, when, sort of 3 parts. Like, when do you do it? How do you do it? How often do you do the training with your youth group? Like in what context and so on?
Yeah, we typically do this every year. We do some kind of suicide prevention training, and literally last year we sat in a room with parents and youth and kind of did a presentation. That's different than this one, but it has a lot of the same information in it. It's more teenage friendly, I guess, so to speak. It's now a policy on our end that we're going to try to do it every year. Some kind of.
The other question I had too, there's a high incidence of cutting and self-harm and so on. So, like, as you've worked with those that you're either in practice with or in youth ministry with, has there been a pattern of those that are more likely to attempt are also self-harmers already, or is there not a real ratio?
It's not necessarily linked. I have self-harming is not necessarily a precursor to suicide. I have several youth that are actively self-harming, but they're not suicidal at all. But it can be a warning sign, and should be something that we get a referral for anyway if you find someone who is self-harming. In the story of my earlier youth, that was kind of the last. I mean, she was checking every box, but then she showed me she was self-harming too. It definitely is a warning sign, and they need to be referred right in as well if they're self-harming.
Jennifer, I see you unmuted. Do you have a question?
Yeah. What in your training has this? I don't know. Maybe I'm being devil's advocate when I ask this question, but in your training yearly with the parents and the students, has this possibly caused a student to think, "Oh, I can do this," and then it starts going down that path?
Yeah, the studies show that you're not going to give them the idea of suicide by talking about it, or even asking someone who is not suicidal. The studies show that they're not going to say, "Oh, I didn't think that," or basically, it's okay to all the clinical evidence show it's okay to ask. It's okay this should be something you talk about, and it shows the other way. It says, "Wow, this person cares enough where they're willing to ask me a hard question," and wow, Kris loves me enough. And that he's willing to, you know, be there with me if things are bad. So you're not going to give them the idea. Numbers have proven that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. As Brad was asking about self-harm, not necessarily being a symptom or a precursor to suicide. Another big thing that does play a big role in suicide is depression. And I'm talking about clinically depressed, being clinically depressed. So we can get into a whole discussion about, you know, I think some of this stuff, mental health has been glamorized by our society today, and youth. I see a lot of youth in my practices and in my youth ministry that say, "Hey, I had I have a panic attack last night," when really they were just crying and they were upset and they couldn't breathe. So there's kind of been a whole badge of, you know, I see a lot of my kids trying to say like, "Oh, I'm depressed," or "I'm anxious," or it's almost like a badge of honor. Like, look what I'm carrying. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the effects, because anxiety and panic attacks and depression are all on the rise and with our youth and are important. They're just become such buzzwords. But I wanted to put this in the slides just so you could kind of see what kind of the clinical definition of depression is. But the possibility of suicidal behavior exists at all times during a major depressive episode. And the big things we look for in this is this one right here: hopelessness. You know, feeling sad or hopeless every day for 2 weeks. This is a big one. If they're hopeless or there's nothing to live for, and then also isolation. These are the kind of the two that I look for. If they don't want to be around anyone and they are showing this hopelessness, those are major warning signs. Other signs of depression are, you know, if they're not sleeping anymore, or if they're sleeping all day, if they're not eating anything, or there's been a big appetite change, they can't concentrate anymore, if they're if there's more crying than usual, or just those they're not stable, they're up and down, they're mad, they're sad, there's just big mood swings. If someone's having a major depressive episode, there is this possibility of suicide is there. Again, it's not our place to diagnose someone as youth ministers or youth workers, but it's just another warning sign. So if you kind of see that a kid wanting to isolate, or, you know, any of these big changes, these are another warning signs for you to jump in and intervene. Questions are on those?
Julie, you had a question, I think, before?
I think it was more of an observation of what Kris was saying when Jennifer asked her question. And the whole time Kris was talking, and he was talking about sharing it with his students and being open with those conversations, I was thinking that actually allows them to see that the youth minister or the leader really cares, and that they're willing to have those hard conversations from the get-go. And so it almost opened up doors for Kris that may not have been open had he not had those discussions or these trainings.
That's a great point, Julie. The youth that I had hospitalized in December, I was worried about her in August, and I was following up with her as much as I could, and I was getting nothing. I couldn't get in. She wouldn't talk to me. There was clearly something wrong, but she wouldn't open up to me at all until that week when she texted me and said, "I want to meet." And as sad as I was to hear what she was going through, she was on my radar. I wasn't surprised, but that work I had laid, that training and me following up saying, "Hey, are you okay?" I really feel like that set the tone for her to call me or text me that day when it was at the so you are kind of laying the foundation.
And I like the idea that you've got, parents there too, because I think that's the key thing that I try to help youth ministers and folks understand is, like, our job as youth ministers is not just to focus solely on the audience of youth, but to make sure that we're providing tools for parents and caregivers to have the opportunity to have conversation, right? Or even recognize. So, like I as a parent of two teenagers need to know this stuff, and so I think opening the door for that, to have the conversation and have the words, right, for the parent to be able to have the questions or have the markers and so on, and even vice versa, because we know that parents can also suffer from depression, right, and anxiety, and so it creates a more holistic space for families to have conversation around this topic.
Yeah, and that's what I was happy with. That was basically, I told them, you're having a conversation when you go home. If you didn't like what I said at the presentation, they're going to go home and talk about it. So at least they're having a conversation with the kid about suicide. Moving on, the last warning sign we're going to talk about is another obvious one, but it sounds obvious, but you will see these, like youth giving away their prized possessions, making the rounds, saying, "Hey, will you come to my funeral next week?" Letting people know the date, or asking them to speak at their funeral. And if this is another big one. If someone is saying these things, we're intervening right away. Those are the warning signs. Those are the major warning signs that are something you might see on, at your small group meeting or at a youth event. Those are things that you can kind of see that are different, or hear or observe. And again, after we see that, now that you've seen a warning sign, I want you to know, like, how and when and what do we do? I want you to provide hope for those in need. And so for the rest of the presentation, we're just going to kind of cover the do's and don'ts of dealing with someone who is suicidal. And again, remember, you're on the front lines. Your check-in may be the only check-in that stops the attempt. Maybe the check-in that stops the attempt. So when you get to that point, we need to know, what is your role. Again, your role as a youth worker, as a volunteer.
Ask early, ask directly, and ask often. We've talked about warning signs. You've seen them. You're building a list of appropriate resources. So I encourage all youth workers and volunteers and churches to kind of develop a referral list. Do you have therapists in your congregation? Is there a community network that is a good place to refer? But mainly, you just want to make sure we connect this person to help and provide hope. Do not be afraid to ask. You're not going to give them the idea of suicide. As I said earlier, 4 out of 5 teens who attempt suicide, they give clear warning signs, which includes talking about suicide before the attempt. You're not going to give them the idea, but the opposite's true. The fact that you're having the conversation is a good thing.
Ask the most important questions of all. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Ask after you have enough information to reasonably believe the person is suicidal. Ask in a way that's natural and flows with the conversation. Don't ask as if you're looking for a no. Brad, y'all can see me on the camera, right? Or I need to turn my screen off. I want to show you. When I was in my internship, I worked at a large private school here in town, and I had to videotape some of my sessions, and I hated it. And there was one question I kept asking. It wasn't about suicide, but it was about something else. But I was asking it, and I was shaking my head no. I was like, "Hey, do you want to talk about your anxiety?" or something like that. But in my mind, I was putting off a no. I was telling her, "No, don't ask me. Don't ask me." So when you ask, you need to be asking it as if you don't want the no answer. You're not looking for the no. It's okay to say either way. So what does this look like exactly? The first thing you need to do is you need to manage your emotions. The biggest thing is keep calm and be compassionate. Calm and compassion are needed the most and are the hardest to maintain when working with an individual at risk for suicide. Manage your reactions. Do not put your uncomfortableness and your anxiety on the youth. Understand that your reactions impact the at-risk person, your emotions, your attitudes, and your beliefs. So be yourself. Let the person know you care, that they're not alone. Don't worry about the words you're using. If you're concerned, your voice and your manners will show it. And most importantly, remain calm. Listen more than you speak. Let the person dump. Let them unload. Let them yell. Let them vent. No matter how negative the conversation seems, the fact that it exists is a positive sign. Be sympathetic, non-judgmental, patient, calm, accepting. This person is doing the right thing by talking. Act with confidence. Use open body language. Don't sit all closed off with your arms crossed and your shoulders turned. Lean out, lean into it. Be there, actively listening and tracking what they're saying. Be supportive, but mainly the biggest thing is offer hope. Reassure the person that help's available and that these feelings are temporary. Let the person know that their life's important to you. If the person's saying things like, "I can't go on, I'm so depressed." When the young lady was sitting in my office in December, and she pulled up, after she had told me she had written a note and how she would do it, and she pulled up her sleeves and showed me her arms. Everything in my body was screaming, "Oh my God." And I was, "Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap." But outside of my body, I just leaned over and I put my hand on her shoulder and I said, "I'm here for you and thank you for sharing. We're going to get through this." So Manage your reactions. Don't put your uncomfortableness and your anxiety on the youth. Next is what not to say to someone who is suicidal. And this is a big one. And this is where we kind of get into what, number one, don't argue with the suicidal person or try to call their bluff. Avoid saying things like, you have so much to live for. Your suicide will hurt your mother. Or let's look on the bright side. This is not the time to argue with something. This is not the place to be arguing. And number two, don't act shocked or lecture on the value of life or say that suicide is wrong. This isn't the place for that theological discussion on suicide. Again, we're in that moment where someone has disclosed they're thinking about killing themselves. This is not the place for you to lecture or to preach a sermon on the value of life. A big one for youth ministers is the third point. Don't promise confidentiality. Refuse to be sworn to secrecy. Again, a life is at stake. You may need to speak to a mental health professional in order to keep this person safe. If you promise to keep your discussion secret, you're going to have to break your word. An angry youth versus a dead youth. As a therapist, I'm required to break confidentiality if someone tells me they're going to hurt themselves in any way or if they're going to hurt somebody else. So even ethically, as a licensed therapist, I break confidentiality at this point as well. This can be a big point for some, whenever this is a big point sometimes around youth ministers and youth promising confidentiality. So there are ways that, think about your wording here on how someone says, I'm going to tell you something, but you have to promise not to tell. Like, how are you going to respond? If someone says it to me, I say, well, yeah, we can talk, but if you tell me, you're hurting or you're going to hurt yourself, there's a bigger conversation and we need to get more people that can help us. So really make it about them, or say, hey, if there's something we need to talk to your parents about, I'll go with you, or I'll be right there with you. But you're not going to say, no, I'm not. You can't promise secrecy or confidentiality. That's the big point I'm trying to make.
And do you feel like in that situation you've ever had a student, like when you've said, or a person's say, make the decision then not to share?
Fine line of that's where I go back to the ground rules, that ground rules that I've set up with my kids, and they know that I'm there for them. And that I'll walk with them, just like I did with the youth, who I had asked her many times throughout the semester and got to know everything's fine, until the minute where she told me. So that's kind of where it goes back to the relationship and you actively listening and then know you're here for them. So I think that's the line. Don't offer complete confidentiality. It's my takeaway here. All right. Next, don't offer ways to fix their problems or give advice or make them feel like they have to justify how they're feeling. It's not about how bad the problem is, but how badly it's hurting your friend or the youth. Remember Kevin from my first story. He didn't want anyone to fix his problems. He literally wanted someone to say, are you okay? So you're not trying to fix it. And kind of the last two are for what we a little bit talked about earlier was, don't blame yourself. You can't fix someone's depression. The youth's happiness or lack thereof is not necessarily your responsibility. And as a youth minister here, don't try to be the hero. Though it's important to act immediately, it's better not to act alone. Helping a suicidal person is not easy. It can take a lot of energy and emotional kind of wear and tear. Having that support of others can help you help someone else. Additionally, you should never put yourself in danger as well if you're worried about that there's a weapon involved and your own safety is involved. But we do want to get them help immediately, but just be safe for yourself. You don't be the hero. Another story I have with this, not trying to be the hero, and I've seen this numerous times around suicide and just some lesser stuff as well, is the youth and adults trying to take on other people's pain. I had a youth at the school I was working at, an internship, whose mother died of cancer, and his two best friends were with this kid 24/7. They spent the night at his house. They sat in the front row of the funeral. Literally, they were carrying this kid. They were like, we're here for the thick and thin. It was beautiful. But within 2 weeks of them constantly supporting this kid, both the other two kids, one was so sick he couldn't come to school, and the other one was hospitalized for suicide. So the kids kind of took on other people's pain and tried to carry it for themselves. I've seen this a lot in our youth group as well. Again, not around suicide, but just it's kind of like the kids will talk to each other, and it's like, well, I'll just carry that for you, and they take it on, and then they kind of they get affected by someone else's pain as well. So it's kind of like teaching those healthy boundaries on what you should be caring and what you shouldn't. And then that's kind of a different lesson for a different day. But that's just another common thing I've seen happening more and more these days. Questions on what not to say?
So one question I had, going back to that. So helping the friend who knows their friend is suicidal in that process, because I've had this situation happen with a couple of young adults, and just reminding them that when they say, well, so-and-so has expressed this desire to hurt herself, and I've told her that, that's not God's plan for her, and so I think just reinforcing the conversation to say, how do we help friends who know there's something going on? One, not, like you said, not take the pain, try to fix the problem, but two, also have appropriate language for them to be able to share back. And that just keeps coming to mind, that conversation with those two.
Yeah, it's almost like we've hammered empathy so much over the last few years. They do it wrong now. Like it's almost like it's I said earlier, like it's like, how much can I carry for my friend? And that's how they view like friendship is, I'll take all this for you, and I'll be depressed with you. And that's not what empathy is. That's just empathy is walking next to somebody and walking with them, but not taking on their pain. But it's just being in that moment with them, reaching them where they are, not silver lining it or trying to minimize it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So we've talked about what not to say, and the biggest thing at the end is what to do. And again, we start with where to refer. These are all on. You can all find these online. Every city has different ones, but these are kind of the national ones. This is a talk line. The first one. This is so you can call and talk to a crisis worker. This is if they don't want to talk out loud. They can literally text 741-741 and reach a crisis worker as well, and do it through text. There may eventually be a phone call. That could be a place to start a conversation. And if worst case is, you can call 911 and have a safety check by the police. Now, I caution you, if at this point, if the police are coming out to get a youth and they're going to take them to the hospital, these kids you're going in handcuffed. So it can be a traumatic experience. So really, this is where you use your judgment. This is kind of more of a last if you can't get them to engage in any of these other things or get help, or they're by themselves and you can't get to them, this might be a last ditch effort to call 911. But it is an option. But the main thing we want you to remember is don't go at it alone. To get help right away and provide hope. Be willing again to ask that most important question: are you thinking about killing yourself? And again, I've kind of gone all over this again, but just we want you to just let them know that you're there for them. Get that web of support bigger and bigger, and do it immediately. So don't wait too long. Provide that hope that they're going to be okay and it's temporary. So that's the bulk of it. I'm happy to dig into other ones, and here's some of my contact information if anyone wants to talk further. Brad, I'm happy to answer more questions or kind of dig into what else we need to talk about.
All right, questions. We can all unmute if we want to. Adam, I see you are. Thoughts or questions?
So how do you help the parents realize the severity of the situation? In a lot of these cases, that I have had experiences with, a lot of parents don't understand what could happen, or where their child are.
Yeah, that's what my rule is. If I see those warning signs, I'm having a conversation with mom or with dad, and trying to just check in and say, hey, are you aware that that I'm seeing this? Are you seeing this? And then help kind of pointing out, educating the parents as well. That's one reason why I want them in on those trainings, is so they can see the stats and say, oh, this is a big deal. And no one wants to hear that their kid is thinking about killing themselves. And that was, just like the girl I described. She didn't want her parents involved. She said, no, they won't engage. That they're going to minimize. They're going to blame me for spending money to go in the ER. The second we called them, it was 1:00 in the morning. They were there in 20 minutes, and they were all in. Of course they were. But to the kid at the time, she was worried that, they don't love me. They're not going to be there. So it's just interesting to see the pain and around family dynamics. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, but
No, you did. Yeah.
I just make them aware, and then I highlight that as a warning sign.
In your practice, Kris, when you talk to young people, what and, this is a broader conversation, but like, what are some of those frontier stress factors that they're expressing to you that's causing some of the suicidal ideation spaces, or depression, or just the intensity of anxiety? What are those frontline things that you see?
The big ones I highlight are just first the perfectionism, and that the kids have never failed before. So they've never experienced failure. Failure is the worst case scenario, when really it should be a learning experience. But these kids have never experienced failure at any level. Literally a trophy for just showing up at times. And the other ones are just wanting to belong, wanting to fit in, and then the negative power of social media, excluding people, the instant ranking of how popular you are or not, or how not popular you are. So just kind of that whole that self-worth, and where they get their rankings from versus where how should they see their self-worth. Those are the big ones for me.
Thank you for joining us, everybody, and we'll do some editing, and then of course this is shareable to other folks, and if you, after watching it again, or if you're watching it for the first time, if you have a question, Kris put his contact information there, and also we'll have our contact information in the video, so you'll be able to send us a question, or if you need to consult with Kris, Kris is available to talk with you, or possibly Kris is a licensed family therapist, and so if you need someone that understands youth, then I would recommend Kris and the resources that Kris can connect you to. So,
Brad, I'm happy to maybe set up a time where I could come visit with your church as well, and share that presentation as needed. And I've done that for a couple other churches in the neighborhood. So just reach out to me and let me know if you have any questions, or need more advice or something else.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kris. We appreciate you doing this, and thank you all for being with us. So.